Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today we're going to dive into a little bit of depth around a topic that, as many of you know who listen to the show quite a bit, we are kind of exploring all sorts of aspects of AI and the trends around AI, how people are beginning to build them. Obviously we've talked a lot about models, but today we want to dive a little bit deeper and start to get into some of the patterns that we're going to see as people begin to build more applications, as they have to think about things like security, things about user permissions, and all sorts of things that ultimately, define what your user experience looks like. And so really excited today to have Jake Moshenko, who is CEO and co-founder of Authzed. Jake, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Excited. We were talking a little bit behind the scenes. You and I, while we didn't directly work together, have a little bit of overlap. But why don't we start there? Give us a little bit of your background, and then a little bit of the journey that you guys have been on with Authzed over the last 3 or 4 years.
Oh yeah. So for my background, I've been a technologist for, almost 20 years now. I went to University of Michigan, went out to Seattle for a little while, worked at some of the big companies out there, then came over to New York, worked at Google. And it was at Google where I really cut my teeth in developer tooling and distributed systems. And as part of that, I met Joey, who was our current CTO at Authzed, CTO and co-founder, and who is my second-time founder. So while we were at Google, we decided we wanted to leave and start a company together. We made a company called DevTable, and DevTable was an online IDE. It never went anywhere. You've never heard of it. But as part of building that, we stumbled on the need for hosting private container images. And so out of that need, we built a product called Quay, and Quay was kind of an overnight success. The very first ticket we ever got from a user was, how do I pay for this thing, right? Like, we put the Stripe dev keys in the prod thing when we launched it. And that was like totally different for us, right? We're like, oh, okay, this is what traction is supposed to feel like. So we stuck with Quay for a little while. We built that out, got it to a pretty good spot. And then we sold it to a startup called CoreOS. And as you know, as a Red Hatter, CoreOS went on to be acquired by Red Hat in 2018, I believe, for about $250 million. And then, Red Hat also got acquired by IBM. And through this journey of building DevTable and Quay and some of the products for CoreOS and Red Hat, there was this common problem that just kept biting us, which was, how do we build flexible authorization that can keep up with our users' requests? I said the first ticket for Quay was, how do I pay for this thing? But the second ticket was, this is cool and all that I have repositories, but how do I map it to my organization? I need support for teams. I need support for an org level namespace that isn't associated with a single user. And those kinds of requests just kept coming, right? It was like, how do I do this? How do I do that? And the thing that separates what we were doing as a private Docker registry from like an open source public Docker registry is authorization. So this was like core to what Quay offered, right? It was like, take this public concept and add authorization, make it secure, make it private, make access limited. So we struggled with that for a little while. There were actually features we never even shipped because authorization was too hard. Like a lot of things that required recursion or like nested, teams nested within other teams, things like that. So we just kept struggling with that. And then when we left Red Hat and IBM, we decided, hey, we've suffered from this problem. Like, let's solve it. And right around that time, Google released a paper, the Google Zanzibar paper, that talked about how they do authorization internally. And so we used that paper as sort of a blueprint to found our current company, Authzed. We've been kind of executing that mission ever since.
Yeah. So we're going to dive into Zanzibar. So you guys didn't, we've talked to plenty of founders who had been at Google at some point in time, maybe had built a system, right? So, an example for people might be, Joe Beta had started doing some Kubernetes stuff and eventually, spun out a company with Craig. You guys weren't actually you didn't build the system at Google. You took the ideas that they had. Did you have to recruit people from Google over to kind of help you figure out what it did or adapt it from how Google does it internally to make it something that's public? Or how did you go from this paper? I mean, obviously you guys had a lot of experience having built systems that did authentication and authorization and so forth, but how did you get from their concept into what you turned into product?
Yeah, it was, not only did we not work on Zanzibar, but Zanzibar wasn't even a production service while we were at Google.
Okay.
So we had never used it as developers. So what we built is a clean room implementation. So we started with the paper, the concepts in the paper. The paper goes into not only the model, but also the architecture and performance bits about how to make it scale, how to make it performant, how to keep tail latencies, like your 95th, 99th percentile latencies, how to keep those in check. And it was just a totally clean room implementation. We actually, when I went through the paper the first time, or maybe the second time, the first time I was like too excited and telling Joey like, hey, we got to quit our jobs and go found a company on this thing. But the second time I went through the paper, I took notes in the margins and underlined things and scribbled on things. And that's actually what became the basis for this annotated Zanzibar paper that we created. So we host that at like zanzibar.tech. Maybe you can put that into the show notes, but there's a version of the Zanzibar paper where there are sections highlighted where we have, our thoughts about what do you think Google meant when they wrote this? What's the question behind the question? Or what were some of the architectures they considered before they landed on this one? So we went through the paper literally word by word, paragraph by paragraph, and outlined some of the like thoughts behind the thoughts, or how we deviated from this paper, or how this thing works in practice. But yeah, being a clean room implementation helps me sleep at night. I don't have to worry about Google's lawyers come knocking, right? So, we don't have any insider information or anything like that. And we just kind of took it from there. One of the neat things, though, about being based on a paper is that, or I guess this isn't based on a paper, but based on what Google wrote about their experience, is that Google gets to tell developers, you have to use this. And we're a company doing business with the public. Nobody has to use anything that we build. So we had to sort of start with the paper as a framework, but we had to extend it in interesting ways to make the DevX usable by, mere mortals and people who aren't being forced to use it by the powers that be.
Yeah, that's always been the experience I've seen as we've talked to different companies that have either spun out of Google or spun out of LinkedIn or any of the sort of really big web companies. Is if you just took the technology, it's interesting, it's powerful, and then you sort of go, but most of the world probably wouldn't necessarily operate it the way that Google did or the way that Twitter did or whatever. And that adapting it to real world or sort of regular world use cases feels like the sort of magic that you have to do in terms of going, okay, how would a bank use this? How would how would a healthcare system use this? How would a gaming company use this? And I got to imagine, for you having kind of like you said, a clean room and being able to think about, well, what did they mean? That's probably been a lot of the nuance of how you've turned it into a commercial service.
Yeah, absolutely. We wrote about some of those experiences in the annotated Zanzibar paper, but there are things about Google's infrastructure that get baked into the concept of Zanzibar. One is like they have a spanner, right? Like we have a spanner in the form of Google Cloud Spanner, but we don't have a spanner in AWS or we don't have a spanner in Azure, right? So it's like, what do you do in the absence of a spanner? Another one is like every entity at Google gets assigned a Gaia ID, like human and non-human. Gaia is their like authentication service. So it's like we don't have a clean, non-repeating, enumerated list of every entity on planet Earth. That's what they have. Another example, they use Slicer to divvy up the workload and address hotspots. So like Slicer doesn't really exist outside of Google. Like Uber had an open source implementation for a while, but I think it's like abandoned at this point. So there's just all these assumptions baked in about Google and Google technologies. And I think that's one of the reasons why they feel comfortable even writing about it. Because like historically, it hasn't been the easiest thing to take Google technologies and turn them into companies and turn them into like generally applicable things.
Yeah. It's
Borg and Kubernetes being sort of the like massive counterexample.
Right. But yeah. And again, I think you're right. They feel infinitely confident. They're like, look, some of the real secret sauce of this you can't replicate, or you're not going to want to replicate or whatever. Let's go back a little bit just to put some context around this. We wanted to talk about sort of authorization at scale, and obviously one of the topics people are starting to talk about a lot is this idea of AI agents and the possibilities of AI agents. I'm curious, if you could kind of help us with like a Venn diagram. Obviously, there's a lot of principles and a lot of kind of primitive things you have to do to build an authorization system, the problems they have. And then, as we think about what these AI agents are going to end up doing at some point in time and becoming mainstream, where do you start to think about saying, okay, the patterns, the workflows of AI agents with their, sort of 24/7 sort of, doing stuff and recursive things. And also like, how do you see that needing the advanced stuff that your system that your system can do in terms of the next level of scaling, the next level of resiliency, the next level of making sure that you're providing security the way you're supposed to provide security.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about agents. Those are definitely the hotness, but we should also touch on RAG a little bit at some point.
Absolutely.
We can start with agents, though. I think when you think about an agent, right, like that can take a couple of different forms. One of the manifestations of agents that we're seeing is like a computer program that's tied to an LLM, and the tokens tell that LLM to go do things to APIs, right? And in that case, it's like, well, you very clearly want the agent scoped to, at most, the authorization that the person who authored the agent or the person on whose behalf the agent is running, right? Like you don't want it to exceed that authorization, right? So like someone writes an agent and they say, hey, Jake, run this. Like it shouldn't run in admin, right? It shouldn't run at root. It should be restricted. And like, I also don't necessarily want agents running with exactly my permissions if I'm the one who kicks it off either, right? Like CEO of Authzed, I probably have pretty widely scoped permissions that I don't necessarily want to share with every agent who's doing anything for me, right? If they're trying to book my flights, I don't want them able to go and access HR records, right? As an example. So when we think about that, we start to think about terms like attenuation or delegation, right? Like how can authorization play a part in the story of making sure that these agents don't have excessive agency, right? How do we make sure that they're only doing the things that they should be doing? And I think the model really kind of follows sort of like user-defined roles model that we've seen in certain products. Something like a Salesforce or an Atlassian will have user-defined roles where you can say, all right, I want a new role. It's just going to have these 10 permissions, and I want this thing to run under the context of that role. Kubernetes RBAC is a similar thing, right? You create roles and you create role bindings, and you have things that run under the context of that. So I think as a sort of like infinitely flexible authorization engine, there's definitely a story, like a part for us to play in that story of how do we enable these delegations, enable these roles, and then limit the agency of those agents to only what we want them to be able to do.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense. I think, the more we can kind of, think about these systems, like you said, in terms of roles, we don't have to think, obviously there's probably levels where you can get granular, but it does allow you to sort of go, okay, this role is going to do certain things. That role is going to do certain things. If I want to move them, I don't have to get into nitty gritty that you're probably going to make mistakes on per se. So yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. Have you seen some of the like computer use stuff coming out of agents where they basically just turn them loose on a web browser?
Right.
That is interesting, right? So like, do they log in as me when they're operating on my behalf in these web browsers? And then the whole, how do you limit their agency, reduce excessive agency, is sort of an interesting problem because a lot of those websites aren't architected for that idea the way APIs are with things like Auth scopes.
Right.
So definitely an interesting wide open story. And I think we're going to be talking a lot about that in 2025.
Let's go back, like you said, like agents are a thing that people are excited about because sometimes we tend to get bored in technology. RAG is a thing that has become very mainstream for people trying to bring their own data to AI environments. Walk us through sort of the things that, as people get their vector databases set up and they're trying to access that information, where does kind of authorization come into play and what are some of the things that people aren't necessarily thinking about yet, just because they're not far enough along in getting into production or some of the errors they might run into or problems they might run into.
Yeah, I think when it comes to actually, let's just start with a quick refresher on how like a standard RAG pipeline works.
Sure.
I think that'd be useful.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so you have like a document store. Think about your like SharePoint or Google Workspace or I don't know, Snowflake, something like that. You've got a place where data is stored.
Any knowledge base, yeah, exactly.
And all of those things have their own concept of authorization, right? So like you and I both, we both have access to Google Docs, but we have access to different sets of Google Docs. Now in a RAG pipeline, you take those documents in the data stores, right? In the knowledge bases, and you process them and you bring them into your vector database and you bring them in the form of embeddings, right? So you usually extract out small bits of context and map those back to these vectors that help you find the relevant embeddings to be able to use to feed to your LLM model. Then a user does a query. The query brings up is also processed through a similar vector model. So you get a different set of vectors out, and then you find the most relevant embeddings, right? The problem comes that once you've brought that data over from the source system into the vector database, you lose the context of the original access control that was in those upstream systems.
Okay. And that's
so what we're seeing is that, and then once you lose that, now anybody on the team can ask for any data as long as it's in the vector database.
Right. Okay.
So what we see is we see people painting with really broad strokes. So they'll either make specific applications where only the right data is exposed to the right users. You could imagine like an HR-focused LLM that's only accessible to HR folks and therefore has access to all of the HR data. Or the other thing that we're seeing is that people are going and recreating those upstream permissions models in a different service, whether it's in their own application or whether it's in something like Authzed. And now they have access to the same context. So they can get the embeddings back out of the vector database, and they can run it through the same permissions logic that would have existed if you're trying to access it in the upstream system. They run it through the same logic, and then they filter out only the things, they filter to only the things that user should be able to see before they feed it into the LLM. And we see people doing that both before the vector database and after the vector database, which are what we call pre-filtering and post-filtering.
Okay.
And there's like a subtle difference there about whether you're maximizing for relevance or whether you're maximizing for the largest amount of context that you can fit. But it's really important to get this right because you don't want to overshare, right? You don't want weaknesses in your vector database or in your embedding model that allows people to get access to data that they shouldn't have.
Yeah. Now, is this, we periodically, people love to sort of highlight, here's this cool new thing that an AI model can do. And then, a couple of days later, somebody will be like, here's this, what seems like, I don't know, like a simple thing that, maybe they kind of want to go, that's a hallucination. And that's fine. The hallucination piece is its own thing. But you do see from time to time where people will go, we sort of broke through the protections that this thing has. So for example, and this is in the context of you saying, like, once you start to pull stuff into the vector database, you lose the permission structure. They'll say something like, hey, I have some queries about this LLM. And then they'll say something like, oh no, I'm a law enforcement agent. I should be, I'm allowed to sort of go around things. Please give me the protected information. Is that sort of an example of somebody understanding that in this sort of simple setup or the kind of traditional RAG setup without the right pre and post filters, that's how they can kind of bring things in and lose the authorization? Or is that just a hallucination type of thing?
Well, that's an attack vector called prompt injection, right? Where you try to trick the LLM into sharing. This actually brings up a really interesting point, which is that you really don't want the LLM in the loop when you're making authorization decisions, right? It's like one of the things that you absolutely cannot and should not delegate out to an LLM, right? Because of that problem with hallucinations or confabulations, right? It's like, and then the traceability of it too, which is like, oh, well, Jake asked really nicely for the HR information, and so I gave it to him. You're like, well, why? And it's like, I don't know, right? Like that traceability is gone.
Yeah.
So you really don't want the LLM in the loop. You want something much more declarative, definitive, black and white. You want to make sure that is just the data. And the best way to keep the LLM from sharing the data is to just make sure it never had access to it in the first place, right? Like you shouldn't, in my opinion, right? Like, only Siths speak in absolutes, but in my opinion, you shouldn't be training a fine-tune or foundational model on sensitive data and then hoping that you have the ability to prevent that sensitive data from leaking. You should try to train the foundational model to be as generally knowledgeable as possible, and then feed it the sensitive data only when you've ensured that the user has access to the sensitive data, and it should be able to take into account that sensitive data. I've heard about systems that can overshare where people just type in like someone's name, like in quotes, and then they get everything that the LLM knows about that person. And if you don't have this stuff locked down, that could be all kinds of wacky stuff, right? Like, and people share things. It's like the public S3 bucket problem of the cloud days. It's like things are shared by a link and they didn't know that they had access to something, but it turns out they actually did. And then all of a sudden it shows up. So you really want to make sure this stuff is locked down and that the permissions are attenuated to the level of the user.
Gotcha. Now, given how new so much of this space is, and certain things feel fairly simple to set up and so forth, are you guys finding you're having to do a lot of teaching and sort of reference architectures to explain even like those most basic things, like, okay, you've been told maybe you should try and train this model or tune this model, but do you really know what you're doing? Do you see where these holes are? Because the security team may not always necessarily be in the room, or you may have been an application developer and just been like, oh, I used to just authenticate with Active Directory or whatever. Are you having to sort of feel like you're involved with groups that maybe didn't think about authorization or in as much depth they had to before?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case. We are starting to do more in the way of education around AI and authorization. One of our teammates, Evan, is putting together a talk about RAG and authorization and how it all fits together with the architecture diagrams that I was trying to draw in the air with my hands. So we are sort of getting a little bit into the education bit. But I think an interesting part is that people either think that the problem isn't solvable, and so they solve it a different way with like the coarse-grained example that I gave, where it's like one model tied to one data store and then gate access to the model in the data store together, instead of trying to do things in like a nuanced or fine-grained way. And that only works insofar as like people can be bucketed in like really broad strokes. But the other thing is that we're like, the people who are bringing us in to help with their AI story, they know this is a problem, right? Like they know they don't want to do it that way. They're considering, I buckle down and write some code to recreate all of these permission systems from these upstream services? Or do I bring in something like Authzed and just model it out and be done with it? And delegate that off to a provider.
And what are you finding as far as like patterns and use cases? You guys obviously, as a company, you offer a SaaS version of your thing. Do you also offer something that people can run themselves as like a private cloud type of thing? What are you seeing the most common sort of usage pattern in terms of interaction with your system?
Yeah, for broader Authzed outside of specifically AI use cases. Our most popular offering is our dedicated offering, which is where we go and run a copy of our whole stack right next to your workload.
Okay.
So if you're running on US West 2, we're right there with you. Same availability zones, same region. So we can give you a VPC private link or a private service connect, I think it's called in Google. But you get sub-millisecond latencies to a completely private, dedicated instance of Authzed just for your workload. We do also offer on-premises. So some people in like regulated industries sometimes have to opt for running it all within their VPC explicitly, or on-premises if they're like using colos or their own data centers. But by far, our largest customer base is on our dedicated offering. It's kind of the best of both worlds in terms of latency, but also they don't have to carry the pager.
Right. Yeah, and it makes sense. It's offload the work, but take all the like you said, latency and cost and all that sort of stuff out of the equation. Are you seeing similar kind of patterns from an AI perspective, or do you see anything different happening as people are, because RAG, you start to get into some things like, where is our data? Was our data in the cloud originally, or was it on-prem in some data lake or something? Do you see similar patterns initially, or are we just not far enough along to kind of see the replication yet?
Yeah, I think it's way too soon to sort of extrapolate out into what the larger patterns will be. Because I know there's businesses who are trying to do all of this in-house, right? They're bringing down something like Llama and something like Milvius, and they're trying to keep everything on their infra and within their data centers. And then there's people who are taking the exact opposite stance and trying to outsource all of it. So they're using OpenAI or Anthropic, and they're using Pinecone, right, for their vector database. So I think it's too early to tell like which will be the biggest source of business for us, but like people are trying everything.
Yeah.
I haven't talked to a single company who doesn't have some kind of initiative around AI going within their company. So
right.
The full gamut.
Yeah, and it feels a lot like the early days of cloud. If you go to every company and they go, yeah, we got cloud projects going on, and you say like, well, okay, what are there? Who running them? And it's all over the place, right? There's some centralized stuff. There's a whole bunch of lines of business doing things. There's some shadow groups doing stuff, and you're kind of looking at it and you're like, okay, they're all going to end up being somewhat different, and at some point, they'll come together and find some consistency. But yeah,
it's like from Heroku to OpenStack, like it was all called cloud.
Right, exactly. I want to come back to something we talked about at the beginning, right? You said you guys had to figure out how the system was built, how you went from the Zanzibar system into the Authzed system. Obviously, you guys make it simpler for people to sort of interact with it because you, in many cases, run it as a managed service or private service. What does a consumer of your service have to know about the system? Like how hard is it to get started, or what types of things do they potentially have to do differently with their application to really take advantage of the benefits of the system?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference or the biggest mental hurdle is that you are bringing on another database, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a permissions centric database. So wherever you were delegating out to your database to do authorization or to keep track of who was allowed to access what, now all of that information lives inside of Authzed.
Okay.
So I think that's the biggest shift. In terms of modeling, like we've got a playground. It's very, very natural to model a lot of these use cases. And we've got examples all the way from basic RBAC to some attribute-based stuff with our caveats feature to a full user-defined roles Google Cloud IAM style solution. So there's a lot of great starting places for people to get going when it comes to the modeling. But yeah, I think that you are bringing in a different data store that's permission centric is a big, like you have to be on board with that in order to have a successful adoption. And we've been lucky that like people definitely see the value of having a centralized permissions database at their company.
Gotcha. And are you sort of being asked then? I mean, obviously, if you deal with the enterprise, you deal with regulated, like they always want you to interact with some existing or legacy system. Does the system allow you to like federate with an Active Directory or something along the an LDAP or something, or do you sort of have to be the source of everything?
Yeah, one of the cool bits, I mean, you can certainly do those things. You can use something like Skim to reflect your Active Directory data over into something like Authzed. But one of the cool bits is that we're mostly focused on providing end user facing authorization.
Okay.
And a lot of those tricky integration problems, those come when you're thinking about like first party IAM stuff, right? Like that's when you're asking, how do my employees get access to these various systems that we're using or these various pieces of data? But like when we look at those examples, Google Docs, Gmail, YouTube, even to some extent Google Cloud IAM with the scale that that's operating at, we're really looking at like end user facing things. And so you're not so much knitting together systems as you are providing a great, delightful experience for your core product. And so I think from that perspective, developers are like, oh, cool, it's an API. I talk to it this way. I do checks this way. Now my app has flexible permissions built into it.
Gotcha. Very cool. Yeah, you and I talked about this before the show. One of the things that we would love to be able to do is go on and on for hours, but in podcast form, whiteboards are oftentimes might be your best friend. Or in this case, I know from reading through the Zanzibar paper, but more importantly, some of the stuff that you guys had done to sort of explain it. It's really interesting technology. It's really interesting, sort of the complexities of problems that start to happen with our interconnected applications, and the things that the system can do to deal with those and keep them in sync and deal with scale and so forth is really interesting. So if this is a space that is something that you're building new applications, you're starting to get into the AI space, whether it's around agents or obviously with RAG and so forth, I would definitely go spend some time digging into it. It's fascinating technology. It's really interesting the way that you guys kind of explain what's in there and how it can become powerful for sort of solving problems. So I highly recommend it. I'll say it was an easy read. It wasn't a terrible read, but it was a very mind stimulating read. So I highly recommend it. There's some links to it in the show notes. For folks that are, digging into this space, what are some of the easy, best ways to engage with you guys to get started with the whole Authzed experience, especially, if you're doing some stuff around AI and you want to make sure that you don't get your company in trouble?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest thing, and I know engineers hate this, but the easiest thing is you can just go onto our website at authzed.com and book a call with us. We always bring technical people, even to the first calls, so we can talk about what you're doing, what you're worried about, what you think you might be doing better. If you're one of these people who likes to read everything before they book a call, our docs are great, and our blog, especially the early on blog posts, we need to do a much better job of surfacing these like closer to the top, but the really early on blog posts paint a great picture about the philosophy around why centralized authorization, why the Zanzibar model, why we built a company around it, right? Like our time is our most precious resource. And like, we're not doing this because we think it's silly, right? We're doing this because we think it's like absolutely core and solving real problems and helping people build delightful experiences. And we talk a little bit about that experience in the early blog posts.
Yeah, and I will say, having worked with the CoreOS team and obviously the folks that the CoreOS team trusted in terms of engineers, it was always fun working with those teams because they always had very creative ways to look at complex problems, and they were always looking for ways to go, yep, I know it's complicated, but the result of this, the thing that you interact with, has to be simpler. And you guys were always super passionate about taking complicated stuff, building some really cool things behind the scenes, and then making the end result very, very simple. So if I always found it took a little bit of going, okay, you guys think about it a little bit differently, but then once you wrapped your head around the way that you guys were sort of being elegant around solving it, it was always sort of these eye-opening, light bulb moments. So excited for people to kind of see what you guys have built. And again, the market for this stuff looks like it's, continuing to kind of explode in new and interesting ways. So excited to have you guys working on it. With that, folks, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I want to thank Jake for his time. It is getting towards the, end of the year, beginning of the year. People are busy with stuff. So appreciate his time and educating us on this stuff. And if you're in the AI space, or, even if you're just building new and modern applications, definitely something to go take a look at with Authzed. With that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you on behalf of everybody who listens, everybody who tells a friend about the show, helps us grow. Hope you all are doing well. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.